Welcome back. So here is another problem for a second. This is a nice logic problem that we're going to attempt to tackle together. I'm going to start you off and I'm going to examine it. So we have here a chart with the results of 6 soccer games between the teams A, B, C, and D. And we have listed, for instance, A won all 3 of their games, which means that A beat every single, so all 3 of these games, we know that A had to have more scores than each of the others. All right, let's start with, so that's a piece of information. We also notice that it had 0 scores against it, so which means that B scored 0 goals, C scored 0 goals, and D scored 0 goals. This is how we know this much so far. So far we've been able to answer just by using logic. So my goal is to simply go through here and say, what information can I apply first and foremost, and then we'll come back. Now, continue to look at A real quickly. You'll notice that they scored 7 goals. However, just looking at A, I don't know if those 7 goals were against D, if they were against C, or if they were against B. So that's the problem, is I don't know how many scores they had in each game. Okay, that's really is a big problem. So let's kind of just hit a pause on that for 1 second. All right, let me get rid of that. Okay. Let's come to B and see if it can tell us any more information. So now we're going to focus in on B. Well, they won 1 game. So in 1 game, they had more points. They lost a game. Well, we already know which game they lost. That was here. Because we know that A won every single one of their games. And they tied in 1 game. Well, since A did not tie, we know that tie had to come against. So that means that B, let me just write this down real quick and type it in. That means B beat, B lost to A, B tied C or D, and B beat C or D. But what does that mean exactly? Well, part of this is when you beat someone, so if we tie their scores, whatever game this tie had to be at, it means they had to have the same score. This one, they had to have more points than the other team, which means they obviously couldn't have 0. They had to have 1 or 2, at least 1 more point than their opponent. And they lost here, which means they had to have 1 less. Well, let's look real quickly at these things right here. Actually, this is kind of valuable information. We can see that B, excuse me, B only had 1 goal scored for them. Well, since they had to score at least 1 point to beat C or D, that 1 point had to be accountable. So it's that 1 is going to be either 1 right here, or it's going to be a 1 right here. And they tied. Well, they had 1 goal scored against them. We also know that they didn't score any goals, by the way, because A didn't give up any goals. But A had to beat them, which means that A had to score at least 1 point, which means A is going to have only 1 point here because that's the only point that B gave up. See, because B gave up, well, I've now taken care of that so that B, let me put a text in right here. B gave up no points against C or D. But wait a second, since they have a tie and they gave up no points, the only way to tie when you give up no points means it's a 0-0 game. So we know that one of these games, BC or BD, was 0-0, and the other one had to be, had to be 1-0. All right. So we actually know, and now notice, if I do this 0-1, we have now accounted for all the key areas we have to deal with. First off, we have 1 game, 1. They beat C or D. They lost 1 game to A. They tied a game against C or D. They scored one total goal, because if you look at 0 plus 1 is 1, and they had one goal against them. So we have now answered one of these 6 games, and we're kind of just fuzzing through it. So we're piecing this together piece by piece with the information. And notice, instead of attacking the entire problem at one time, I am trying to take it on one step at a time. All right, let me get the eraser and kind of get some stuff out of the way, because we're done with this on B real quick. We'll come back and figure out which one are these. Is it C? I don't need to worry about, nope. I don't need to worry about A, the A situation, but that's kind of the problem right now. So, because that game's already taken care of, but I do need to leave this up because it gives me information about C and D. Okay, so let's return to our examination for a second. So again, C now won 0 games. They lost 1 and they tied 2. Well, we know they lost 1. Let's just stop right there. If they lost 1 game, we know that had to be against, let me give my erase. So we know that if they lost 1 game, that game had to be against A, which means that they tied C. So what this means, let me circle this. What this means is, namely, I'll put it over here, that C tied B and D. Now, wait a minute. We know that B had to tie C or D, but because they tied C, we know that now know what that score is. So we now know, using my eraser, I can get rid of these. And I can go. All right. This score was 0, 0. And this score was 1, 0. That was what we had over here, but this score was 0, 1. That's A had 1, and B had 0. C, you now know it, had to be 0, 0. And that's because of this thing right here. So we'll notice a couple things. They had 3 goals scored for them and 8 goals scored against them. Well, we know that these 3 goals they scored could not have been against A, because A had 0. Similarly, it could not have been against B, because we know that that was a 0, 0 tie. So all 3 of these C scores had to be against D. So that number just became 2 because we counted for 3 of them. So I know that C scored 3 points here. Further, I know they lost 1 and tied 2, which means if they tied D and they scored 3 points, then they gave up 3 points to D. So this number is now 5. Now, notice we've dealt with their game against B and their game against D, giving up 3 points total. So 5 of the scores had to be given up when they took on A. And all that leaves is that there's 2 of, so they scored 7 goals. We've taken care of 6. So there's only 1 goal left. And that will be now notice, let's go through and let's evaluate all these things that we've come up with. So we've now logically worked through this and eliminated step by step, and we'll now see if these all make sense for us. All right, so I'm just going to erase all of this stuff, and so all that's left is my scores. All right. So my first question is, how many games did A win? So let's just start with A. Well, A obviously won all 3 games. Check. They lost 0 games. Check. We tied 0 games. Check. 1 plus 5 plus 1. If I add up all of those scores, it's 7 with 0 scores against them. Check. Okay, so we've now taken care of all the A games. All right. Now, let's consider the B games. So I'm going to put arrows next to all the B games. So this game and this game. So I got all 3 of my B games. As we can see that B lost to A, they tied C, and they beat D, which means that they had 1 win, 1 loss, and 1 tie. Okay, good. They scored 1 goal against D, check, and none others. And they gave up 1 goal to A and none others, check. All right. So now we've taken care of that. Let's erase those. Let's deal with the C situations now. All right, so we have C, C, and C. So in our 3 C games, if we look at it, we have 2 ties, namely BC and CD, and 1 loss to A. And if we go through here, that is correct, that's correct, and that's correct. They won none of their games, but they did lose them. All right, so now they scored 3 goals. Well, they scored 0 against. They scored 0 right here. They scored 0 right here, and they scored 3 right here, which means that this 3 is satisfied. Let's put a little check mark. Boom. Last but not least, 8. They gave up 5 goals to A and 3 goals to C and 0. So 5 plus 3 plus 0 is 8. So boom, we have found that correct. All right, last but not least, let's consider our D. All right, so D, if we look at this, I'll put stars next to them. Here's 1 D game. Where's 1 D game? Here's 1 D game. All right. As we can see, they won none of their games. They lost to A, they tied C, and they lost to B. So they won none, and they had 2 ties and 1 loss. Okay, that works out beautifully. They scored 3 goals against A. Sorry, 3 goals against D, and no goals in their other 2 games. They had 1-0 games, and they had a big shootout. So as a result, they had 3 goals scored, but they gave up 5. And as we can see, we've satisfied the table. So this is the process that we just said. We devised a plan. We just said, let's go through it row by row. Let's see what that gives us information. Let's put down key parts that we know, and we'll fill in as we go along. As we executed that, we were able to come up with a very clear plan and do it. Hopefully this helps you in your process. Please let me know what questions you have. Good luck.